Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry we're getting a little late start here. I got a lot of files to bring up here, so I apologize for that. So we'll go ahead and get going. I assume everybody here, everybody in the room is taking exam 3, right? Everybody's taking it? Okay, so I know there was some interest in the class last week for going over the third exam, and we had a couple of people do it as makeups, as late exams, and so I do allow the opportunity for students to do that. So it's always kind of a trade-off between getting faster feedback, which I know it's got its purposes and it's got its value, and the flexibility that we can afford by offering makeup exams. And so it's one of those deals where I think that the advantage really is in the ball's in your corner in terms of giving you the advantage here by allowing you to do that makeup. So I think there may be one person who did not, and unfortunately we just weren't able to put that together in time. So not the lowest of the 4 exams. So what we're going to do today, let me sort of switch the camera over here a bit. We're going to talk about the third exam, which was due 2 weeks ago. Okay, and so that's what we're going to be doing at the beginning of the class here. And I just want to give you a rundown since we're deep into the semester. We're now in week 13. We've only got 2 weeks left, or I guess 2.5 weeks. Yes. so I guess that was a little bit of exaltation there. So exam 3, we're going to go over exam 3. We're going to cover that. We're going to go over the answers. And so if you have questions, now's a good time. For those who are on the Zoom call, you can feel free to shout out, and we'll go over those. And then what I'm going to do is, I thought what we would do is I'll finish up a bit of chapter 14 today, and then I'm going to skip chapter 15. I was looking this over the weekend, and I think it's a good chapter, but I'm sort of running a little bit low on time. And as I told the class at the beginning of the semester, that if we are running a little bit late, this is more chapters probably than what I've ever tried to get using this new textbook, this free online textbook. And I don't think we're going to have a chance to get there. Okay? I really don't think we're going to get there. So I'm going to probably get into chapter 16 just a bit today. I don't think I'll finish it. On Wednesday, I'll pick up and we'll finish chapter 16. Then we'll be into week 14, and maybe I should let myself some more room here. For 10, we'll come back on Monday, and I'll talk about chapter 19. And then which is that Wednesday, we'll review for the 4th exam. So I know it seems like we've got a lot of exams coming, but again, these are the only assessed activities in the class. There are no quizzes, there are no discussion activities, there are no papers, So this seems to work well, at least from the feedback that we get over in our course evaluations. Then in week 15, what we'll do is this: on the first day of class, which is that Monday, what I'm going to do is go over previous exams. Okay, so if you have, and we'll go over exams 1 and 2 basically. Okay, and this is something that it's been sort of a trade-off between going over exams and not going over exams, particularly the attend anywhere sections. We've got more people in this class than what we ever really have for attend anywhere. Believe it or not, most of the attend anywhere students prefer to watch it online or live or on the video, and so it makes it a little bit challenging to kind of go over the exam. And I make it available, make the answers available, and that's how we do it in the online sections. And so from that standpoint, I guess I've sort of approached the exams more like the 100% online courses, where I sort of make it available, and if students say, "Hey, number 27, what is that?" Explain that. I can certainly do that. But given the fact that we've got a pretty good amount of attendance physically, and that's fine. I have no difficulties with doing it. Long before we did online education, I was going over exams in class, so there's no problem there. So we'll go over those exams. I'll answer any questions you've got, and then the very final day of class, this is going to be your opportunity to do what you think you need to do in this class. If you need to bring questions, I'll be more than glad to answer them. This is our last class session, and what I'll do is I'll review for the final exam, and I'll give you some details as to what to expect on that exam. Okay, and so I'll go over what's going on. You'll be available through that Sunday. Now, I know that occasionally people will say, "Hey, I missed this exam," or whatever, my internet went out, or whatever, an asteroid landed on my house, or whatever, and I didn't take the exam. But you're going to not want to be in that situation on the final, because number one, it's not a grade we can drop, and we don't really have much time to do a makeup. Maybe think so, because we've got a very tight time reporting to C&M for the final grades. And the reason why is very simple, that people's financial aid is at stake, people's prerequisite, this may be a prerequisite for something else, maybe a prerequisite for some other program at another college or university. And so they really keep us on a tight leash in terms of getting grades in. So just make sure you try to take that. And I'm always pretty available during final exam week. And if anybody, I'll probably just, I'll probably just have you call me if something goes wrong in the exam. It's Brightspace is for all the things that I know students are sort of ambivalent about Brightspace for those who used to work with the old Blackboard system, but for all of its complexities, I think is probably the word, be pretty stable, as opposed to the old Blackboard system, which occasionally would kind of go down and just collapse in the middle of an exam or whatnot, and it was not a good situation. But if something like that does happen, feel free. That's the game plan. And chapter 19, the reason I cut out chapter 15, it deals with poverty and income inequality. That's a good thing. We're going to get into that a bit. Chapter 14, I think that in the interest of time, though, I think that as important as this is, I think probably this is more important. And I definitely wanted to always get into chapter 16, which deals with risk and how we assess risk and how we determine what is the riskiness of something. And we'll give a definition of risk that may not be what you may have in your minds already as to what risk is. And chapter 19 is an international dimension, and this is increasingly important, particularly in business schools, because there's a really high likelihood that a lot of you will have some involvement with the international dimension of business, whereas in previous generations, maybe not so much. Okay, so that's the game plan. So any questions about that as to what we're doing here before we go forward?
On 417, can we also go over exam 4, exam 1, 2, and 4?
If everyone's taken it, and the problem is if everyone hasn't taken it, then we really can't go over it, because I do allow that makeup opportunity. So I really need for you guys to take this exam when it's due, because otherwise, I can't make the Zoom. It's a live Zoom link. I can't really control the content. So I would like to be able to do it. If everybody has taken the exam, I will. Something tells me that's not going to happen, just given my experience. But if everyone's not taken it, what I would suggest you do, if you have taken it, if you want to go over the exam, to get with me individually during this, either that day, after class. I mean, I'm here pretty much every day, or sometime in that week, and I'll go over it with you individually. I'm more than glad to do that. And actually, you know what? We might be able to. Well, by that, I would hope everyone has taken it by this day. Maybe we'll go over it on that day, on the 19th. Let's just see how everyone does on exam 4. Because I know if somebody misses one of these first 4 exams, we just simply drop it and make it go to 0, and it doesn't really affect everyone's grade. So this is one of the reasons. This is again there's pros and cons to doing things in a lot of different ways, and one of the cons here is the fact that sometimes people miss an exam and think, well, I'm just going to let that one go to 0 and whatnot. So, but I mean, that's to your benefit to be able to drop that, but it does sort of leave us out there waiting for, because I have no idea whether or not people want to take the exam or not. So I don't make it available the week afterwards. But if everyone's taken it by the 19th, I'll be more than glad to go over it. That's a good question. And my assumption was that it would not have been done, but I really encourage everyone to try to get that done, mostly because, well, first of all, for no other reason than it's a busy week anyway, this last week of the class. And so this is why I usually don't put any new content in. And in fact, the reading material for this last bit of the class is going to be fairly modest. And I think we've gotten over really the heavy lifting there. So, okay. All right. Any other questions for me before we talk about the third exam? Well, let's do this. Let's see what we've got here. Let me pull up the exam and I'll oops, hold on a second here. Okay, let me try to get this out of the way here. So hopefully you can see that, can you? So let's go to the exam. This is the view. My view may be a little bit different than yours, and so let's kind of go over this, and maybe I'll kill the lights here a little bit so we can go over the answers. And this is your class session. Feel free to stop me and say, hey, what's going on? I'm more than glad to try to stop and answer your questions. So this is the third exam, okay? One that we took in week 11. So the first question is this, and it's What refers to the additional revenue gained by selling one more unit? And the answer to that is marginal revenue. That's essentially what marginal revenue is. And I know that sometimes textbooks will say, and I think I mentioned this in class.
Wait,
So-
I don't think that's test 3.
You don't think it is?
No, because I have it right.
Well, the questions are, what, did you print it out or what?
Yeah.
Well, they're scrambled though, is the problem. So
Oh.
they kind of, they get, the program is scrambled. What's that?
No, it was there.
It was there, okay,
Yeah.
all right, it was there, okay, so. Yeah, the programming scrambles the questions, and I think also scrambles the answers too, so. All right, so marginal revenue is the answer to that question, and when we talk about marginal revenue, I think I mentioned this in class, that sometimes textbooks will say one more unit, and again, in real life, and that's true, certainly, but in real life, when you're dealing with thousands of units, you know, even in a day, it may be, you know, dealing with a larger incremental piece of that, maybe it's the next 10,000 units, the next 100,000 units or whatever, but it is not incorrect to refer to that as incremental revenue is marginal revenue, okay? So that's number one. Number two, if a firm's revenues, and you guys can all see this, I hope, is that too small? If a firm's revenues only cover its average variable costs, then that firm has reached its shutdown point. And so the shutdown point, this is a little bit counterintuitive in a lot of ways, as I mentioned in the class, we talked about it because we talked about the difference between break even and shutdown point. Because break even is not one of the answers here. So there shouldn't have been that much of a confusion as to that point. But it sounds like break even point would be below break even would be the point at which a firm would shut down, because it's like, why would you want to operate when you're not earning income? And we talked about the difficulties in shutting down, and at least the variable costs are being covered. If you're above the shutdown point, but below the break even point. And so if you're only covering its average variable cost, that firm has reached the shutdown point. Below that, the firm is operating and producing zero output. And this is simply a case in which either costs are out of control or the price has fallen. And this is one of the explanations also for why firms in perfect competition tend to have fairly short lifespans. It just is a nature reality of the situation. Okay. All right. So that's number two. The next question is number three. What is calculated by subtracting the firm's costs from total revenues? So this is one, it's accounting profit. It's calculated by subtracting costs from revenues, okay? Excluding opportunity costs. Accounting profit, okay? So accounting profit is simply revenue minus costs and not including the opportunity cost. Economic profit is the one that includes opportunity costs, okay? That's the only one that works on that answer, okay? Number four, economic profit can be derived from calculating total revenue minus, this is a very similar question, minus all the firm's costs, including its opportunity costs. So it's a similar question, a little bit of a different wording there. In this case, we're talking about including the opportunity costs. Now, opportunity cost is something that we talked about fairly early on, particularly when we go back really all the way to the production possibilities model, where we said that one of the most important concepts in micro is the sense, well, really all of econ, but certainly in micro, is the idea that you have to account for the value of something you did not do. And so this is something that's very important. And from a rational standpoint, we like to think that we're trying to study economics in a rational kind of way. We need to account for the value of something we did not pursue and include that in our calculation, because the idea of economic profit is, am I making the most profit I can by doing the thing that I'm best at doing and avoiding that which I'm less good at? And that's really what the issue is with that. And we're going to talk a bit about that some more, particularly in chapter 19. We're going to kind of come back to that. We talk about the concept of international trade, which I know in some classes, if you take macro after this at some point, you probably had this a little bit earlier in the class. But we'll talk about the idea of even nations focusing on what they and avoiding what they do less well. And that's one way that economies can develop economically, even if the only thing that they really have to trade is labor. And that's just one way to leverage what they do best as opposed to doing what they do less well. Okay, it said that a perfectly competitive market, raising the price of a firm's product from the prevailing market price of $179 to $199. Well, what's that? Well, we said that firms here have no pricing power, so it can likely result in notable loss of sales to competitors. And the issue here is the fact that because there's no price power, the firm is a price taker in perfect competition. And if you raise the price anything above $179, and again, there's a little bit of leeway here. You could maybe raise it a little bit, but not very much. And particularly in the absence of barriers to entry, all these things which go into the definition of perfect competition. Low barriers to entry, lots of competitors, standardized product, one product is the same as the other, it's undifferentiated, then raising the price doesn't do you any good. And by the way, I know we talk a lot about gasoline in this class. It's understandable because gasoline is one of those goods that sort of pop up and down. It's extremely volatile, but from the retail standpoint of gasoline, it's one of the most price elastic goods that there is out there, because how many times you're driving down the street, and you see a gas station on the left that has gas for $3.28, the other across the on the right for $3.29, and you'll do a U-turn, you'll cross traffic just to get that 1 penny per gallon, and you will. People will do that all the time in order to save that, because of the fact that gas is pretty much gas, despite what the TV commercials say about, hey, our gas is shell gas is better than whatever or whatnot. That's not really. I mean, they add some additives to it, but I don't think I would buy that. So people go with a lower price. Number 6, if a perfectly competitive firm is a price taker, then what? Pressure from competing firms will force acceptance of the prevailing market price. So again, firms are price takers. There's nothing they can do. They can't really do anything about quality. They can't increase or decrease the output. They can't, force other competitors out of the market. And we talked about this idea of eggs. This to me was really just a perfect example. It came along at a good time in this class because everyone was talking about the price of eggs and how eggs were $5 a dozen or 4 or 5, whatever they were. And everyone was saying, my God, what's going on? And there's all this talk about, I saw a couple of articles that talked about the fact that the egg wholesalers are getting together and agreeing to rig the price of eggs. And that's really not, it's a supply shortage, mostly due to a bird flu that's going around. But, there are 19,000 some, I think the figure I actually looked it up. That's what I do. There are like 19,000 egg farmers in the US, and there's no way that they're going to try to rig it and get it together. And I know that they were sort of focusing on the wholesalers, but the wholesalers are in competition with each other too. So there's really nothing you can do. And by the way, the price of eggs has begun to fall slowly, but it is falling, and nobody's really talking about eggs anymore. And so sometimes that's a perfect example of perfect competition. And the same goes with gasoline. Gasoline, you take the price that's given and it's gone down, it's gone back up, it's done a lot of things. Okay. Another question about perfect competition. Idaho farmers can sell as large a quantity of their potato crop as they wish. The answer is provided each is willing to accept the prevailing market price. So again, it's very similar kinds of questions here. There's no issue with the short run or long run. We're saying that any economic profit is possible in the short run, but it's not due to the price of the product. It's not due to the price that the firm sets, because the firm doesn't set it. The price may be high for whatever reason, and as a result, those lucky enough to be competing will get the price, but the price will fall, particularly as barriers to entry are low, new suppliers come in, and it's difficult. Another example of perfect competition I think we talked about was orange growers in Florida. It seems like every winter, maybe not this winter, but every winter we hear a story about orange crops being destroyed by freezes, and orange farmers are desperately trying to put heaters out and whatnot, because they know that if they say what they can say is that the price is going to be very high because the supply will have shrunk, and it's not something that they would have done. They simply are lucky enough through economic luck to get that higher price. Okay, so accepting the price is given, nothing you could do, even increasing or decreasing output, nothing is going to influence the price. Okay. Number 8, in a free market economy, firms operating in perfect competition are said to have only one choice, and that choice is one quantity. So again, nothing with regard to price. Nothing with regard to inputs. Quality issues are irrelevant. These are standardized products. And again, price to charge is not there. So a lot of these are sort of addressing the same sort of issues. Then under perfect competition, any profit maximizing producer faces a market price equal to its marginal costs. Now, we saw how in equilibrium that any firm, let me get back up a little. Any firm in any industry is going to want to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In other words, they'll produce the output level at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Well, the thing about price and perfect competition is that price equals marginal revenue, always, always, always. And this is the only structure in which that is the case. In fact, we said that the other 3 structures, which were monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly, were notable for the fact that they did not have a condition in which price and the marginal revenue were equal. We had what was called the negative price effect. So you have the demand curve here, you have a very steep marginal revenue curve. But in the case of perfect competition, price is always going to equal marginal revenue, And because the condition in this question is profit maximization, if price equals marginal revenue, price must also equal marginal cost, okay? Okay, let's see here, number 10, we have a diagram, and let's hope, okay, they're good. Sometimes these don't always come across, let me make sure I blow that up a little bit for you. And I hope everyone's seen it on the Zoom. Yeah, well, you know what, maybe not, I think maybe I'm not getting the camera. My apologies to everyone on that, but you should be able to view that. As soon as I make that available, you should be able to see that. So, okay, this graph here is total revenue, total cost. And we didn't really go over the graphs on this very much, but it's essentially sort of interpreting what's going on. And that is the connection. We talked about profit being a case in which it's total revenue minus total costs. And this question asks, at the range of output represented point B, and what's going on? Well, simply the red curve is total cost, B is total revenue, so the answer is total cost exceed total revenue. So all it really is just sort of an interpretation. I don't know that was anything too difficult. I hope not, at least it's easy for me to say, but that's the issue there with point B. Okay?
I thought it was too easy to, it was so obvious.
Yeah, well,
I mean, I
Sometimes
checked
they're-
this still 4 times.
well, sometimes they are. Sometimes they are completely.
How easy can it be? Right?
Well, okay, all right. Well, sometimes they're easy, sometimes they're not quite so easy. So, okay, let's see. In economic terms, a practical approach to maximizing profit requires a focus on how changes in production affect. Again, marginal revenue, marginal cost is the answer there. That was a little bit of a tricky question there. And this is one that came out of the test bank. And so some of these questions come out of the text themselves. And so that's maybe a little bit trickier one. But again, there's no real issue in terms of affecting total cost or total revenue, because we say that in economics, we're focusing on the marginal. That's where the action lies, is focusing on the marginal. That's what we're focusing on. We have totals, averages, and marginals, and we're really focusing on the marginals. Okay, so we have a table here, and I tried to find the most straightforward tables I could. And so this question is, okay, you've got price, quantity, total cost. Okay, so you obviously weren't required to fill in all the blanks here. So the only question was, given the data provided in the table, what will the marginal revenue be for production at quantity level 4? Well, if you look at this, notice one thing. At every level of production, the price is 5. So what does that tell you? It's a horizontal demand curve / marginal revenue curve. And so as a result, if price equals marginal revenue, and we know that at the quantity level where the price is $5, then it must mean that marginal revenue must also equal $5. And so that I know there's a lot, it was a really busy graph, but there was not much really being asked for except for that. So the key thing to focus on was this idea of P equals 5. And I think I actually did an example in class where I had the price of $5. That was the example that I gave to sort of reflect and show how in this particular structure, this perfectly competitive structure, it's really the only one in which you have this disconnect between price and marginal revenue. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? All right. That's number 12. Number 13. Another table. And again, these were scrambled, so I don't know where this came in on your exam, but and it's a very similar kind of question here. What will the marginal cost for production equal at quantity level 4? Okay, so marginal cost. So what is marginal cost here? Remember, marginal cost is the change in total quantity. I'm sorry, change in total cost divided by the change in total quantity. The change in quantity at every level is going to be 1. So there's really no denominator. Anything divided by 1 is going to be the same. So at 4, all you're doing is you're going from a total cost of 15 to a total cost of 19, and so it's $4. That's the marginal cost to produce 4 units of output. Okay, and again, marginal cost is not horizontal, but in fact it goes swooshes downward, it kind of goes up, and that's what marginal cost equals. So that's the only calculation there, was simply change in total cost divided by change in output. But change in output was obviously from 3 to 4 is just 1, and so it's just the difference between these two values. Okay, and hopefully that was relatively straightforward. If not, let me know if you have any difficulties with that. So, okay, number 14, for a perfectly competitive firm, the marginal revenue curve is identical. We just kind of talked about this, is identical to the firm's demand curve. Only a perfect competition is the marginal revenue curve identical to the firm's demand curve. Okay, it's different in the case of the other 3 structures. Number 15, which of the following is most likely to be a monopoly. Okay, well, we talked about examples of monopolies, and we said that, okay, we've got some, and we talked about examples of the other kinds of structures as well. And fast food restaurant would not be the case. What about television broadcaster? Probably not, maybe more oligopolistic, but certainly electricity in almost every case is considered to be a monopoly provider. And then local bathroom fixtures, no, that would not be, whatever that would be, we either compete for perfect competition or perhaps monopolistic competition. But this example of utilities, I mean, water, electric, and natural gas, and even in some cases, cable, frankly. These are all examples of monopolies, and we simply refer to these as natural monopolies because of the fact that the economics of this particular structure don't really allow for two firms to compete. So they just have such gigantic costs, and they're really still burning economies of scale, which is why electricity providers always want new customers, and they've got gigantic market areas. I think Con Ed in New York City has actually branched out beyond New York City, our biggest city, just to try to get more customers, to get more economies of scale. And that's just an example of that. But if you had the cost would shoot up for everybody, you'd be slicing market share. So that's really the only example there of a monopoly provider. Okay. All right. Let's see. What's the next question? Number 6, following present the least amount of concern to a firm that has a monopoly over a particular industry. Okay, so what's the answer to this one here? The answer is the competitive actions of other business firms. And so remember, the definition of a monopoly is it's a single provider of a good in a marketplace, extremely high market shares. And again, when we talked about monopoly also, we said, okay, you can still have, remember we gave 2 examples in class of 2 monopolies that neither one had, their historical examples, neither one had 100% market share. One was the Standard Oil monopoly, which is obviously very famous or infamous, and then the Microsoft monopoly on operating systems. And the reason that these were interesting parallels was because not only the way that they created a monopoly, even though the differences in time and type of good were quite stark, but because of the fact that they only had about 90% market share. But that was enough so the competition was really squeezed out and really couldn't much of anything at all. And again, in both cases, one thing that was noteworthy was the fact that they controlled distribution, and so as a result, other firms really couldn't compete. So whatever other firms do, it doesn't really make any difference. Just like if you were to try to start a monopoly on natural gas, I don't think that New Mexico Gas would be overly concerned. Okay, a firm holds a monopoly position in the marketplace is a price maker. So simple definition there. And again, when we talked about monopoly, those first 2 market structures, we said perfect competition was the first one we talked about. And then we jumped into monopoly. And we said that of these characteristics of perfect competition, with the exception of this maximizing behavior that applies to all actors, so in this case, firms, all actors are looking to maximize profit. You can pretty much take all these characteristics, flip them around in their head, and they would equal and they would a monopoly. Take all the attributes of perfect competition, flip them around, they would basically point to monopoly. So price takers in the perfect competition, price makers in monopoly. Okay. All right, monopolist is able to maximize its profit by doing what? Okay, well, remember, all firms in all industries are going to want to produce output with marginal revenue plus marginal cost, and then charging a price along the demand curve. So what they do is they mark the price up, and in order to charge the price that the demand side is willing to pay for that good. And remember, when we talked about monopolies, we said that there are really 3, and I guess really 4 main attributes of monopoly that distinguish monopoly or monopoly pricing from other firms. That's higher price, or other structures, higher price, lower output, and also the creation of a deadweight loss, right? And I guess maybe 4th one is sort of an efficiency loss in general, because of the fact that you've only got one provider and there's no, you can talk about loss of quality and whatnot. Sometimes that's, we do see this happen with monopolies that get complacent and don't feel like they have to upgrade their product and all of that, okay? So the answer there is producing more marginal revenue equals marginal cost and sort of marking that price up. Number 19, which of one of the following is the most accurate description of a monopolist? Well, it's the sole producer of a product for which good substitutes are lacking in a market with high return, high barriers to entry. A long definition, but again, these were all sort of laid out for you. And so hopefully that is relatively straightforward. This one about a sole producer of a defined product class, well, that's not what really we're talking about. With regard to monopolies. And by the way, we talked about the fact that monopolies that we're talking about are really more larger sort of entities, and you know, and there's really no substitute going on. Okay. All right. Let's see. When a natural monopoly exists in a given industry, the per unit cost of production will be lowest when a single firm generates the entire output of the industry. So, and I sort of alluded to that a second ago when I talked about electric utilities like natural gas and electric, because in this case, you've got a single firm producing the output. If you added another firm, both firms then slide up along the average total cost curve, and costs are raised for everybody. And that's not a optimal condition. Number 21, the marginal revenue curve for a monopolist always lies beneath the market demand curve. And this is the case with not just monopoly, but also the other two imperfectly competitive structures, monopolistic competition and oligopoly. It's always going to be to the left. Okay, so it's, or it always lies beneath or to the left, whichever you prefer. Okay, so it's not the same as imperfect competition. It's not above, and it doesn't run parallel. Okay. Number 22, and this is, I'm a pharma company, has received confirmation of the registration for its latest drug patent. It will have created a monopoly by restricting entry into the market. Now, remember, we talked about monopoly privileges, and we said that one of the things that can create a monopoly situation, just temporarily at least, for however many years a competitor has a patent on a good, nobody else can produce that good, at least not legally. And so as a result, entry is restricted. So this is why drug companies go to great lengths to try to create new drugs all the time. And when the drug pipeline is sort of getting stale and no new drugs coming, they really start to panic, because then it moves into something more akin to perfect competition, because, you know, it's happening all the time. When Prozac went off the market or went out of patent, you know, all these other competitor drugs for that particular class of drug come into the market. We see the same thing with other kind of medications. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why we see all these ads on TV for these drugs that frankly deal with some unusual conditions that some of us have probably never heard of. You know, and I'm not saying that they're unheard of, period, because obviously if somebody's making a drug, but it's because of the fact that they know whatever that condition is that they're trying to treat, they're the only one producing it, and the costs and the price is very, very high, very high. In fact, sometimes thousands of dollars per year, which is something that the Biden administration is trying to work against, but we'll see what kind of luck they have with trying to bring down drug costs, drug prices. Okay, the demand curve perceived by a perfectly competitive firm is horizontal. Okay, so it's horizontal, meaning nothing they can do with output. The price is going to be whatever the price is going to be. Number 24, the market structure, which firms are said to be strategically interdependent. The only one that this fits is oligopoly. That's one of the characteristics of oligopoly, is the idea that firms watch each other. And I know that in your text and elsewhere, if you were reading up on oligopoly, you see that there's a behavior known as leading and following behavior. And it typically refers to price. That's oftentimes the item that is keyed off of my textbook authors. But as we talked about in class, it's also this idea that firms watch each other, because there are only a few firms, maybe a handful of firms in the industry, and they're all watching what each other does. And when one firm does something and it works, everyone else follows suit, and they follow the same model. And this is why airlines, which is an oligopolistic industry, every airline is pretty much identical. There's not much. I know some of the international carriers are long-distance flights try to do things a little bit differently, but they're going to charge you a lot for that. If you get on a plane flying from New York to Chicago, it's, you know, unless you remember what airline you're on, you wouldn't know really any difference. They all follow the same sort of model, and they all do the very same thing. They all have the same kind of products. Nothing is really different. And we talked about one of the best examples was broadcasting. Broadcast news and broadcast sports is practically identical. And nobody really cares what network a particular game is on, if that's a game they want to watch, because it is the same experience. There's no one is better than the other. Okay. Collusion arises when firms work together to reduce output and keep prices high. So we talked about this in the case of oligopoly. We said that, look, collusion is possible, and when collusion happens, and it's a very effective collusion, we say that a cartel has been formed. And in class, I remember talking about cartels, and I said that we probably are not well served by some of the news media referring to these drug operations in Latin America as being cartels, because they really don't look very much like cartels, like what we know them to be. That is cooperating producers who agree on territories, who agree on output, price of the product, the form of the product, all that. It's a cooperative entity, and that is called collusion. And again, when we go back and talk about what is a desire for a political desire, a social desire in our country, and that is we prefer competition on the supply side to cooperation, which is what collusion is. And that really is the heart of what antitrust law is all about. Antitrust law being the sort of body of law that deals with what to do about firms that try to rig the market and disadvantage the demand side. Okay. All right. Perfect competition monopolies stand at what? Well, opposite ends of the spectrum of competition. I think we've beaten that dead horse enough. And I think about that. They're polar opposites of one another. Number 27, which of the following would be classified as a differentiated product by a monopolistic competitor? Okay, well, this one, hopefully we got this one because it's the only one that's really branded. Chanel number 5, and tap water, clearly not branded, electricity not branded, natural gas not branded. So, I mean, and the thing about this is these are all monopoly provided sort of goods anyway. Monopolistic competition is a branded, or is noted by branded goods, differentiated products, and so hopefully everyone got that. That's the only one that monopolistic competition would offer. Okay. So there's a question about the Herfindahl. I think we had one or two about the Herfindahl index. So when we talked in the antitrust section, which I think it's chapter 11, maybe, we talked about the idea of how do we measure the power of sellers in an industry. So think about, again, let's go back to what I just talked about a minute ago. That was the idea that from a sort of a societal desire, we prefer firms to be competing on the supply side as opposed to cooperating. So how do we know whether or not you've got enough whether there's enough competition? And so there's this index called the Herfindahl index, and we compared that to two other indexes which are used. One was simply market share approach, which is woefully inadequate, and the other is taking the top 4 industry firms in the industry, which is also pretty inadequate because it doesn't account for the power of big firms. And so when we square the market shares, we and add them together, we get the Herfindahl index, which runs from 0 to 10,000, but it can't be 0 because you can't square anything and get 0 but 0, and that would be illogical. There would be no market share for anyone. But if you have 100% market share, square that, you get 10,000. So 0 to 10,000. The higher the figure, the higher the market power, where no other firms can really edge their way in and compete. And by the way, I think in class we went over an example of Microsoft's monopoly. This is why, because I know a lot of people, I had a lot of students during this time who said, "Why is the government going after Microsoft? What are they doing?" What, you know, and what they were doing was a number of things. First of all, and apparently it's not illegal to be a monopoly; it's just illegal to do things which competitors from coming in, and they were certainly doing that. But also their Herfindahl index was way up there. It was the 9,000s, I want to say. That's extremely high market Herfindahl value, and so clearly they were sort of flashing beacon to regulators on that particular subject. And had they not acted against free trade, which is really what the Sherman Act requires, and maybe the government wouldn't have gone after them. But it turns out that I think the whole thing kind of ended in sort of a stalemate because we still have Microsoft with the product that was at question operating systems. I'm using a Windows operating system. Probably if those of you who got your computers are probably using one as well. I know there are competing ones out there, but they have extremely small market share as in relation. Okay, the next one was, which of the following is a valid criticism of the reduction of competition that results from mergers? And this is clearly why we look at Herfindahl indices, is to find out whether or not the firms are going to raise the price and permanently maintain a higher profit at the expense of the consumer. Because remember, if you've got a monopoly, what's going on is you've got a switch of consumer surplus flowing from consumer surplus to producer surplus. That's considered to be not desirous. And so as a result, this is why, and there's a lot of discussion in your book, just a tremendous amount of discussion about the Federal Trade Commission and what they do. Now, they're not a prosecutorial body, but they're the regulatory agency that's sort of the first line of defense. They can either say yay or nay to merger requests. And they've done this a number of times just in the recent past. I know AT&T tried to buy T-Mobile, and the government said no, and I think Sprint tried to buy T-Mobile, and the government said no. And so they said no because it was the combined market shares would simply put that over the limit, and it's a pretty low tripwire, which is around 1,500 to 1,800. I know that the website that I gave you in class from the Department of Justice website, and the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division is the prosecutorial body. I think it's around 1,800, where they really start to look at industries as being very heavily concentrated and don't want to allow any fewer amounts of competitors. Okay, so that's the criticism of mergers in general. And by the way, this criticism has been around for a very, very, very long time, and as have mergers in general. And there's almost no merger that doesn't attract some criticism for primarily the perceived effect on price. Okay. Next question. Government passed the what? Well, this is the very first act about antitrust. Is the Sherman Act in 1890 to limit the power of large consolidated firms that were run by trustees. Remember the term trustee? This was sort of a way around some of the corporate law at the time, which was probably outdated. Frankly, it was outdated, but it's nonetheless, it didn't prevent these firms from sort of getting around it. And that is by forming these trusts, which were the sort of secret agreements. I'm going to take over your refinery. You're going to be owned by us, but nobody's going to know it. You're going to be a front person. You're going to share the profits. We're going to control output. We're going to squeeze the railroads. And I'm talking about Standard Oil here, obviously. We're going to squeeze the railroads. We're going to squeeze the pipelines, and we're going to make sure nobody can, can refine oil. If they do, they won't be able to ship it and all that kind of thing. And that's really the Standard Oil monopoly was really the one that was the primary culprit here. And it took another 20 years or so for the government to figure out what to do with this and to put it into place. It's really kind of amazing. And then once it did that, it really didn't achieve the intended consequences for reasons that were later dealt with in the Clayton Act. I can't recall if we had a question here about the Clayton Act. Maybe, we'll see as we get through here, but that was one of the remedies to the Sherman Act, that very first one, that very first act. And again, I just mentioned this a minute ago. What's the maximum value? It can be reached, and the Herfindahl index is 10,000, because the only way to get there is to have one firm with 100% market share at 100 squared is 10,000. Okay. And then there's some questions about externalities. So positive externalities are not. A positive externality arises in a situation where a third party outside the transaction does what? Benefits from a market transaction by others. And one thing I think is interesting, and I know your textbook author broke these two chapters up, 12 and 13, to sort of focus on the fact and sort of highlight the fact you could have positives and you could have negatives. Now, there's a lot more attention given to negative externalities, no question about it, particularly that one major externality of pollution. But there are benefits that spill over as well. We went over some of those in class. A third party that we call a bystander benefits and that whatsoever. So in other words, they're sort of a free rider in that regard. Okay. And then market failure, and we're going to pick up the ball here with market failure today. It describes a situation in which the market itself does what? Fails to allocate resources efficiently. And I noted, and when we first talked about this, the first aspect of this that we talked about was externalities, okay? But there are other issues as well that are going on there. And some of those we're going to talk about. If we don't get to it today, I'll try to get to some of it, then we'll certainly pick it up on Wednesday and talk more about information failures, which I think is important as well. Number 34, if you're highly asthmatic, as I am, unfortunately, having high levels of industrial air pollution waft over your house every day would be a negative externality. And so no question about the fact that this is a pollution question. It's a negative externality. You're a bystander. You had nothing to do with the externality, but you're separating the consequences, even though you have no connection to it. And remember, the other definition was that they're unintended. So it's not like the polluting firm is really out to make people sick. They may have different levels of compassion for those who are sick. I will grant you that. But they're not really, that's not their business purpose. And it's also, so it's unintended, but it's also uncompensated. So you're receiving that externality with no benefit to yourself at all. It's not like they're paying you $1,000 a month to be sick. Unless you do something about it. We talk about the solutions to those externalities. And if anybody's ever lived in a very polluted city, as I have, it really is an extreme quality of life situation. I think I told the class that I grew up in an area that's exceptionally polluted. And in fact, my wife was kind of shocked that, many of my friends are already dead of lung cancer, just because the kids I grew up with, they stayed there and just got sicker and sicker. And, it's unfortunate, but it does happen. It's a real thing. So, okay, if the government wants to establish a marketable permit program, let's begin by determining what. Okay, so this is this is the explanation of the cap and trade program. Cap and trade is sort of the slang for this idea of marketable pollution certificates that are sold, or they're given to firms that pollute. And then the idea is that the government's going to put a cap on total amount of emissions, and then give certificates to these firms that do pollute. Then they reduce their emissions, they all their excess unused permission allowances to other firms which are less efficient. And the idea is every firm's got an incentive to try to reduce pollution. And the other thing is that over time, these caps are intended to go down so that we're achieving that goal of getting less pollution in the air. And I think in some ways, I think you could talk about some success in these areas. This idea of the carbon trading market is a very active thing where there are intermediaries who try to help others, achieve lower emissions so that they can benefit economically from it and benefit at the expense of those who are less willing or able to get their emissions down. Okay, which of the following would be classified as a positive externality? Okay, and the only one here would be converting a derelict, if you want, to a public vegetable garden. Why is it a positive externality? Well, derelict lots are generally an eyesore in the community. They also attract people who don't really belong there, who do things like camp out and whatnot. And I think the public generally doesn't like that. And so as a result, this is sort of improving the area. We talked a lot about this idea of improving areas, and that it creates a positive externality. And so that's part of the logic of that. Okay, so that's a positive for the bystanders in the area. For a negative externality, I'm getting down to the end here. Private costs of an action are less than the cost imposed on society as a whole. So if you remember what we did here, we talked about marginal cost, and we sort of redefined marginal cost as marginal private costs. And then we said, if there's a negative externality created, there's a cost over and above that. It's just another layer of cost at every level of output. That is the cost that's imposed onto society from some negative event, whatever that is, whether it's unsafe products, we talked about those, whether it's, again, pollution, we just can't keep away from talking about pollution, other kinds of actions as well. Sometimes even things like plant closings. A firm decides to close a plant or lay workers off. It has a negative externality on the surrounding area because businesses go out of business and whatnot. So as a result, the actions are less. In other words, there's a greater amount of social costs imposed on society from whatever the activity is. Okay. All right. Let me see here. We're just about done. I want to sort of get on to the business for today. Homeownership is thought to be an example of a positive consumption externality. So first of all, we talked about positive and negative externalities. We talked about consumption and production externalities. And what is interesting about this is that I think sometimes we have this idea that all externalities are created by firms, but that one actor in the circuit of flow, just firms. But instead, they can be produced by households as well. And sometimes bad things like litter and whatnot, particular activity, particularly property crime. But also they can do good things as well. Home ownership is thought to be that. Certainly the federal government believes that is the case because we've had a number of programs that run back nearly 100 years that have sought to encourage home ownership. And, as an area to improve neighborhoods and certainly even in lower income neighborhoods, all these efforts that the government's been up to for many decades to improve home ownership, the idea being that it would spill over as benefits elsewhere. Okay, so that's one example. I know there's some politics involved with that. I know that in the subprime crisis, there were people who were maligning the government's encouragement of home lending, but that was, people are always going to have a political take on pretty much anything that involves government. We talked about solutions to externalities. One of those was the Coase theorem. So remember, we said that first of all, we had Pagovian solutions, which I think is the next question. And then we had other market-based solutions, non-governmental solutions. So what Coase was saying is the idea, okay, if there's an externality, then it makes sense for the parties to negotiate something that does not involve government agencies, does not go to court, and does not allow, any sort of legal complexity, because but it makes a number of assumptions, and I know that sometimes there's a bit of maybe unease with this particular theorem because it does make assumptions, and one of those big assumptions you might remember is that the parties involved are rational and that they want to arrive at a solution. And another condition is that the offending party recognizes that they've created an externality, and the idea is to negotiate a fair resolution. And remember, we talked about Coase as being a law professor, or excuse me, an economist who taught in the law school at the University of Chicago. So even though this was written, created many decades ago, it really forms a lot of the tort law out there today. The idea that a lot of attorneys would like to sort of settle cases, particularly if they know there's a liability involved, and sell it quickly, rather than let this thing go on and on and on, because as a result, it just simply makes the problem worse, and people dig in their heels. And I think we talked a bit about was it this class we talked about the glyphosate and the whole Roundup thing? It was us, right? We talked about the Roundup and how the firm that makes Roundup is still fighting that. This thing is going on forever and ever, but Monsanto, they've got very deep pockets, and so they should have settled a long time ago. We also talked about the work of Pigot, when the adjective form of that is Pigovian. So it's a tax for government to manage or correct a what? It's a negative externality. And government does that, it's said to internalize the externality. In this way, we can take a problem and tax it. If there's some bad that's being created, not just some good, but some bad, then we can tax it and create that sort of disincentive. Okay. So questions for me about any of those? Any questions for me about anything that we talked about with regard to this? Let me bring the lights back up here a minute. And what I want to do is I just have, and if you do have questions and you are, if they're still sort of bouncing around and you want to think about it, then just feel free to get with me. And I'm here pretty much all the time, and you can always email me or whatever, but I'm more than glad to go over it. And it's kind of good that you all wanted to go over the exams, because I do think it's a good chance, particularly if there's something that doesn't appear obvious, that we can answer those questions, resolve the questions relatively expeditiously. Okay. All right. So we were talking about chapter 14 in class, and in chapter 14, there's a lot going on there, and frankly, it is, and I get chapter 4 until later in the semester. Remember when we first or second exam, I forget which one, and we decided we would skip it, or I decided we would skip it. And the reasons being was that it was a little bit beyond, I thought, where we wanted to go just yet. And I wanted to get into some more marginal values and talk a bit about that. And so we talked about chapter 4 a bit on Monday. And then we are going to talk a little bit more about chapter 14. And we're not going to get into everything on chapter, particularly the aspect of unionization, because I know that there's a lot of discussion about unions. And we could talk about that if you like. It's an interesting topic. I think in the interest of time, we're probably not going to have a chance to get too much into it. For those of you who are interested in labor, UNM has got a specialty, one of their master's specialties. He's in labor economics, and so they do a very good job of discussing that. And unions are obviously an important topic, even despite the fact that unions have, in this country at least, have sort of fallen by the wayside in terms of their ability to create value. And so that's sort of difficult, and they've kind of gotten weakened over time. And I think a lot of people think that's a bad thing, but you can kind of read that on your own. I don't believe there's anything that's going to be on the exam with regard to that. But I want to talk about this. I want to talk about imperfect labor markets. This will be the last topic, and then I'll kind of get into the issues surrounding chapter 16, and we'll sort of pick up market failure. Well, this is sort of, you could say this is sort of an example of market failure also, because whenever you have imperfect competition, then we've got a condition in which markets don't work efficiently and effectively. And so we're talking about an imperfectly competitive market, but we're talking here about an input market, not an output market. So remember, imperfect competition was in the output market consisted of monopolies, monopolistic competition, and oligopolies. Here we're talking about imperfectly competitive labor markets. And what are we really talking about with imperfect competition here is the very similar aspect where there's sort of a dichotomy going on here between the value of the marginal product of labor and what the demand for that and what that labor is actually really producing. And so As a result, the only thing I'll really talk about here is this, that this differs from what we talked about with regard to this idea in perfect competition. We took the marginal product times the price of the good. And here we're simply going to sort of pick up this, talk about demand for labor as being a question of taking the marginal product of labor times, in this case, not the price of the good, but the marginal revenue of the good. Now, why is that the case? Because remember, price and marginal revenue are not the same as they are in perfect competition. So it's marginal product times marginal revenue. And so when we do this, then we arrive at a value then that we simply call marginal revenue product, which is simply this particular equation here, marginal product of labor times the marginal revenue. So what can we say? That the demand for labor is equivalent to the demand to the marginal revenue product. Let's think about what marginal revenue product is. Okay, first of all, it's a dollar figure multiplied by a number. Okay, and remember, everywhere in economics, whenever you have a dollar figure multiplied by or divided by a number, or vice versa, you're going to end up with a dollar figure. Dollar figure is the Trump value. You don't say I earned 5 hours today. Instead, you say I earned $50 or whatever. It's 10 times 5 or whatever the wage rate is, the price times quantity. This is essentially what's going quantity times price here, but the price is different because marginal revenue is a declining particular feature. Okay. And so when we talk about marginal revenue product, what are we really saying here? We're really saying that if we've got marginal revenue product is simply this declining value that looks something like this. And it's the marginal product of labor that's downward sloping. And yet you've got the value of the marginal product of labor that's sort of disconnected from that. Now, the reason it's disconnected is it's not really that much different than the case in which you got, and why is it different? Why is the value of the marginal product of labor different? Because we're saying here that the firms can control the wage, and they oftentimes do. This differed from the perfectly competitive market, in which we said, okay, we've got the value of the marginal product of labor, and it intersects then with the supply of labor, and so you have the wage. In this particular case, so you've got a little bit of a different situation. The wage is simply determined mostly by whatever the firm wants to pay the workers, and so as a result, imperfectly competitive labor markets. And as a result, too, end up typically having a lesser amount of labor, quantity of labor, and we'll start by that. There is generally less labor employed in imperfectly competitive markets. One of the reasons why, too, is the fact that there's also an incentive for firms to employ less labor and to control the wage. And you can look at this very cynically as well by saying, okay, and by the way, don't take my word for it. You can look back, particularly over time, and listen to what firms say sometimes about labor. And they say sometimes they want to sort of keep labor off guard a little bit, make them feel a little bit of anxiety. And whatever you think about that particular point of view is difficult. But firms will oftentimes try to work their way up the marginal revenue curve because remember, or marginal revenue product, because the fact that if you have fewer workers and you simply get greater productivity because these diminishing returns don't set in. This is the key thing to know here is the idea there's less labor being employed and the wage is more or less set by the firms because it's not, you don't have the forces of demand and supply that you do in perfect competition, okay? So all this is sort of a restatement, but in different ways. The main difference is not price here as it is in perfect competition, marginal revenue, okay? And that's really all that I wanted to talk about with regard to chapter 14. I know I mentioned the fact of unions and whatnot. The only reason I brought that up is because there's a substantial amount of content in chapter 14 dealing with things like unions and union formation and different laws concerning unions. So a little bit more than I think what we really have the time to go over. So I think we will. Instead, what I wanted to do is to talk about, hopefully you guys can see that, you don't need it, is to talk about this element of market failure we call information failures. Okay. And I've only got a couple minutes. I probably am not going to really have time to get into it very much. So I'll just talk for a minute or two about this, and we'll pick it up on Wednesday. So remember, this fits under this broader category, what we call market failure. Market failure is defined as the inability of private actors left to their own devices to solve their own problems and to make societal outcomes that benefit society as a whole. Okay. And I'll post these slides for you once I have the chance to update I was at meetings all morning, so I just didn't have a chance to update the Brightspace site, but I will. And I'll post these. So information failures really have two different means, or two different manifestations. One is imperfect information, the other is asymmetric information. So all I really want to talk about today is this first one, imperfect information. But the very definition of market failure with regard to information failures is this idea of imperfect, incomplete, and or unevenly distributed information. So incomplete is mostly this one, imperfect information. It's where parties, and as your text even though it's sometimes not just the demand side that doesn't know what's going on, sometimes the supply side doesn't know. There's not good information. And as a result, people are sort of stumbling around, bumbling around, making mistakes in all kinds of ways, output decisions, pricing decisions, quantity decisions. And as a result, this is considered to be inefficient from a socially optimal standpoint. And we're going to talk about lots of examples of how this particularly works. But we're going to particularly focus on asymmetric information and what that's about, okay? And probably the high priest of this is getting George Akerlof, who is married to the former Fed chairman, Janet Yellen. And we wrote a paper in 1970 called, I think something called The Market for Lemons. And the term, now we have all these state lemon laws that deal with defective automobiles. And it's really this idea that sometimes information is not shared equally. And as a result, there are information failures and breakdowns in the market. But I'll get to that more on Wednesday. The only thing I'll really say about this is the fact that when we talk about this entire category of market failure, what is it that we should know about it? And why does it sort of set itself up as a separate category? Because remember at the very outset, when we first talked about market failure, we said that it's not some indictment of business or the capitalist system or anything like that. I mean, there are always criticisms of all of these actors in the economy, but instead it just simply recognizes the fact that private actors can't always do the job alone. And that sometimes there are mistakes that are made. And this goes against, what's more important is it goes against some of the very original economic thinking known as classical economics that held as one of the basic tenets the idea that everyone has good information. And at one point, maybe in our distant past, maybe that was true. If I were going to buy a horse from somebody, you know, I could look at the horse and I knew what I was looking at in horses, and I could understand what that horse looks like. Is it healthy? Is he not healthy? Whatever. I'm looking to buy some fairly simple object like a pot or pan. But today, the products that we've got are so complicated that there's always going to be some sort of either imperfect or asymmetric information. And the question is, what we're trying to address here is, what impact does this have on the market? Okay, what impact does it have on society, and who wins and who loses? And oftentimes, when we talk about asymmetric information, it's usually I think we sort of associate with being sort of the advantage taker, but it's not just them, because it's also the demand side can also sort of hoodwink sellers as well. You've heard this phrase, buyers or liars. So it really is both sides. And then that'll lead us into talking a bit about insurance and what insurance is about, because it's a completely unique product that's sold in the economy. Nobody would buy it if they didn't have to, because it's a pretty intangible product. And it's a product we pay for up front, always, always, always. And so as a result, it's a little bit different. Okay. All right. So I think that's going to do it for today. Any questions for me about anything we talked about? I know we didn't get too far into this, and I did want to finish up, sort of tie up the loose end from 14. We'll come back on Wednesday and we'll talk more about information failures, particularly asymmetric information. So everybody have a great rest of your day. See you on Wednesday.